The year 1875 had not been kind to Silas Caldwell. The unforgiving sun of the Kansas plains beat down on his worn-out wagon, a constant reminder of the relentless road and the empty space beside him. A year ago, that space had been filled by Sarah, his wife, whose gentle voice and steady hand had guided their family through every storm. Now, only the ghosts of her laughter lingered in the dusty air, a haunting melody that drove a nail deeper into his heart with every mile. He glanced back at his two sons. Thomas, his eldest, was a boy of 15, his face a grim mask of early maturity. He sat hunched over the reins, his slender shoulders burdened with the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon him. Beside him, 8-year-old Henry was asleep, his head resting against a burlap sack, oblivious to the quiet grief that suffocated the air around them. "Pa, how much farther?" Thomas's voice was a low rasp, parched from days of talking only to the wind. Silas forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt foreign on his lips. "Not much now, son. We'll find a place to rest soon, a new home, just like we talked about." The promise was thin, worn out by repeated use, but it was all they had. Their small farm back in Missouri had been plagued by drought and sickness, and Sarah's death had been the final, cruel blow. They were heading west, drawn by the desperate hope of a new beginning, a place where the land would be fertile and the memories less sharp. They passed through a small, forgotten settlement, little more than a collection of weathered shacks and a saloon with a peeling sign. A grizzled prospector sitting on a porch watched them pass, his eyes filled with a familiar weariness. "You folks looking for a place to settle?" the man called out, his voice a low gravel. Silas nodded, his hand tightening on the reins. "Well, you've come to the wrong place," the man said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Nothing but dust and bad luck out here. Folks go missing all the time. The land swallows 'em whole. You'd do better to turn back." A shiver of unease ran down Silas's spine, but he dismissed the warning as the ramblings of a lonely old man. They continued on, the road growing rougher and the sun sinking lower, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Just as despair was beginning to set in, they saw it. A plume of smoke rising from a chimney, a beacon of life in the desolate landscape. It was a farm, nestled in a small, verdant hollow. A tidy 2-story farmhouse stood proud against the backdrop of rolling hills, surrounded by a well-kept garden and a sturdy barn. "Pa, look!" Henry's voice, bright with renewed hope, cut through the silence. Silas felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He steered the wagon towards the farmhouse, his heart thumping in his chest. As they drew closer, the front door opened and 2 women emerged. They were both dressed in black, their mourning clothes stark against the soft glow of the setting sun. The elder of the two, a woman with a severe but kindly face and a tight bun of graying hair, stepped forward. Her name was Eleanor. The other, a younger woman with a quiet, watchful demeanor and dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, was Beatrice. "Well now," Eleanor's voice was a warm, melodic sound that instantly soothed Silas's frayed nerves. "You boys look tired and hungry." Silas dismounted, his legs shaky. He explained their situation, the long journey, the loss of his wife, the desperate search for a new life. Eleanor listened, her face filled with an expression of profound sympathy. "You've come to the right place," she said, her hand resting on his arm, a gesture of comfort that felt like a lifeline. "My sister and I, we know what it's like to be alone. We lost our husbands to the fever not 2 years ago. We have plenty of room, plenty of food. We couldn't possibly let a family in need pass by our door." Beatrice said nothing, but her dark eyes seemed to take in every detail, from the tattered canvas of the wagon to the exhaustion etched on Thomas's face. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Silas looked at his sons. Thomas's eyes, so often filled with a grim resignation, now held a flicker of hope, Henry was already climbing out of the wagon, his small feet eager to touch solid ground. He looked back at Eleanor, at her kind smile and the promise of a safe haven, and knew he had no choice. They were at the end of their rope. We would be grateful for your kindness, ma'am," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Nonsense," Eleanor said, her smile widening. "It's the Christian thing to do. Now bring your things inside. We'll get you boys fed and washed up. Beatrice, help the young man with his bags." As the Caldwells were ushered into the warm, lamplit house, a sense of deep relief washed over them. The air inside smelled of freshly baked bread and wood smoke, a scent that promised comfort and safety. Silas felt the knots in his shoulders begin to loosen for the first time in months. He had made the right decision. This was the fresh start they needed. He didn't notice the way Beatrice's eyes lingered on Thomas, a peculiar glint of interest in their depths. Nor did he see the fleeting, triumphant look that passed between the two sisters as they closed the door behind their new guests, sealing them off from the vast, unforgiving world outside. The Caldwell family quickly fell into a rhythm on the sisters' farm. The days were long but purposeful, filled with the simple, satisfying work of country life. Silas, with a renewed vigor he hadn't felt since Sarah's death, helped Eleanor with mending fences and tending to the small herd of cattle. Thomas and Henry were given chores of their own. Henry, delighted by the novelty of his new surroundings, spent his days feeding the chickens and fetching water from the well. Thomas was tasked with splitting firewood and working the small vegetable garden. He found a certain quiet solace in the labor, the repetition of the axe against the wood, and the feel of the cool, damp earth in his hands. Eleanor was a gracious, if meticulously organized host. The house was spotless, every object in its rightful place. She cooked 3 hearty meals a day, and the Caldwells, accustomed to the lean rations of the trail, ate until they were full, a luxury they had not known in months. Beatrice, however, was a different sort of presence. She was the silent partner in the household's operations, her movements quiet and deliberate. She spent the majority of her time in the kitchen, a space that was entirely her domain. A large iron cauldron sat on a low-burning fire, and a strange, pungent odor often wafted from it, a mix of sweet and sour that Thomas couldn't quite place. She was always brewing something, pouring liquids from large glass bottles into the cauldron, her face a mask of concentration. One evening, after a particularly long day of mending a fence, Eleanor brought out a bottle of dark amber liquid and 2 small glasses. "Silas," she said, her voice a soft purr, "you've worked so hard. This is a special recipe of ours, a little something to help you sleep and ease your mind. It's a special moonshine, made with herbs we grow ourselves. It has a calming effect." Silas, exhausted and still heavy with grief, accepted the glass gratefully. He took a sip. It was potent, a fiery burn followed by a surprisingly smooth finish with a faint, herbal aftertaste. He felt the tension in his shoulders dissolve almost instantly. He finished the glass and found himself talking more freely than he had in months, sharing stories of his life with Sarah, the hardships of the trail, the dreams he still held for his boys. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, her hand often resting on his arm in a comforting gesture. After that first night, the ritual became a staple of their evenings. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor would pour Silas a glass of the moonshine. He began to look forward to it, a small moment of peace and oblivion at the end of a long day. Thomas watched the change in his father with a growing sense of unease. At first it seemed harmless. The whiskey helped his father sleep, and he was less prone to fits of melancholy. But as the days turned into weeks, Thomas noticed a subtle but profound shift. His father's once sharp mind seemed to dull. He became more placid, less inquisitive, and more dependent on the sisters. When Thomas would try to talk about their future plans, where they would settle, what they would do, Silas would simply smile and wave a hand dismissively. "What's the rush, son?" he'd say, his words slurred just a little. "We're safe here. The sisters have been a godsend. We'll figure it all out in time." The man who had always been so determined, so driven to protect his family, now seemed content to let their future rest in the hands of two strangers. The whiskey seemed to be doing more than just calming his soul. It was clouding his judgment and dulling his protective instincts. One afternoon, while Eleanor was out with Silas tending the garden and Henry was playing in the yard, Thomas found himself alone in the kitchen. The strange, pungent smell was stronger than usual. He saw Beatrice's large pot on the stove, a thick, dark liquid simmering inside. A stack of empty glass bottles sat on a nearby table. A wave of morbid curiosity washed over him. What was she making? He cautiously approached the pot, leaning in to get a closer look. The smell was cloying and unsettling. It didn't smell like food or medicine. It was something else. He saw a few dried herbs floating on the surface, but the rest was an unidentifiable, murky concoction. A sudden sound made him jump. Beatrice had entered the kitchen. Her dark eyes, usually so placid, were now fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. She didn't scold him, didn't say a word. She simply walked past him, a quiet threat in her stillness, and began stirring the pot with a long ladle. The message was clear. This was her domain, and he was not welcome. Thomas left the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a growing sense of isolation and foreboding. He was surrounded by kindness and comfort, yet a nagging doubt about the sisters' true intentions was beginning to take root in his mind. He looked out the window and saw his father and Eleanor laughing together in the garden, a picture of perfect harmony. But it felt all wrong. The man laughing with the woman was not his father, at least not the father he had known. It was a stranger, a ghost of the man he was, and Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the whiskey was to blame. The comfortable routine of farm life began to feel more like a carefully constructed cage. Thomas's suspicions, once a quiet unease, had now grown into a full-blown alarm. The sisters' rules, which had seemed reasonable at first, now felt like restraints. He and Henry were not allowed to wander far from the farmhouse, a rule Eleanor explained was for their own safety due to the wild animals and treacherous terrain. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't being protected from the outside world. They were being kept from it. The isolation was absolute. There were no neighboring farms, no trails that led to the nearest town. They were completely and utterly alone with the two women. One sweltering afternoon, the stillness was broken by the sound of a wagon approaching the farm. Thomas's heart leaped. A visitor. It was a lone man, a weathered prospector with a thick beard and eyes that held the hard glint of someone who had seen too many lonely miles. He introduced himself as Jedediah. His horse was lame, and he was in desperate need of a place to rest for the night. Eleanor's smile was as warm and welcoming as ever, but Thomas noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. Her movements were a little sharper, her eyes a little more guarded. Beatrice, who had been in the garden, dropped her trowel and came to the door, her silent gaze fixed on Jedediah with an unnerving intensity. The sisters, however, were perfect hosts. They offered Jedediah a hearty meal and a clean bed in the barn. As the prospector ate, he tried to make small talk with Thomas, who was helping to clear the table. "This is a fine place you found here, son," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "Not many folks out this way. It's a real quiet stretch of the trail. Too quiet, some say." Thomas felt a jolt. "What do you mean?" "Well, you hear whispers," Jedediah said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Talk of folks just disappearing. Drifters, traders, prospectors like me. They ride out here and they just vanish, never seen again. Seems like the land just swallows them whole. Thomas felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. The man from the settlement had said the same thing. Do you think it's the land?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Before Jedediah could answer, Eleanor's hand settled on his shoulder, her smile too wide and too fixed. "Jedediah, the boy doesn't want to hear such things. It's not proper talk for a house of peace. You must be tired. Let me get you some of our special moonshine to help you rest." Jedediah, clearly sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, quickly changed the subject and accepted her offer. That night, as the family and their guest retired, Thomas lay awake, the prospector's words echoing in his mind. He had tried to talk to his father about it, but Silas, already half asleep from the whiskey, had simply dismissed it. "Just an old man's superstition, son. Don't you fret. We are safe here." The next morning, Jedediah was gone. "He left before dawn," Eleanor announced at breakfast, her voice a little too cheerful. "Said he was eager to get to the next town. We wished him well." Silas accepted the explanation without question, but Thomas felt a sick feeling in his gut. A man with a lame horse and a long journey ahead would not leave before dawn. It made no sense. He walked to the barn, hoping to find some evidence of Jedediah's hasty departure. The stall was empty, but as he was about to leave, his eyes caught a glint in the hay. He knelt down and pushed the straw aside. There, buried in the corner, was a small leather pouch. He opened it, his hands trembling. Inside, a handful of gold dust sparkled in the dim light. Jedediah had been a prospector, and this was his life's work. A man would not leave his gold dust behind. It was a testament to his life and his purpose, something he would never abandon. The pouch was proof. Jedediah had not left. Thomas clutched the pouch, the reality of the situation sinking in with horrifying clarity. The whispers of the trail, the disappearances, they weren't random acts of nature. They were the work of human hands, the hands of the two women who had taken them in. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him. He was a prisoner on a farm of horrors, and his father, lost in a fog of poisoned whiskey, was unable to see the truth. The burden of saving his family now rested solely on his young shoulders, and he knew with a chilling certainty that he had to find out what had happened to Jedediah before they became the next victims. The discovery of Jedediah's gold pouch had transformed Thomas's fear into a cold, hard resolve. He no longer saw the sisters as merely unsettling. He saw them for what they were, a clear and present danger. His father, lost in the stupor of the sisters' concoction, was useless, his trust in them absolute. Thomas knew that to save his family, he would have to act alone. He needed answers, and he was certain they lay hidden in the one place the sisters kept locked and guarded, the root cellar. The sisters had told them the cellar was for preserving food, but the way they spoke of it, with a possessive secrecy, made Thomas's suspicions flare. He had seen Beatrice disappear down the cellar steps at odd hours, her face grim with a purpose that had nothing to do with apples or potatoes. He spent the next few days watching, learning their routine. Eleanor was meticulous in her daily chores, her movements predictable and precise. Beatrice, on the other hand, was more fluid, a ghost moving between the kitchen, the garden, and the cellar. One afternoon, a storm gathered on the horizon, promising a violent downpour. The sisters were preoccupied with securing the barn and the livestock. Eleanor was shouting instructions to Silas, who was moving sluggishly, and Beatrice was a blur of motion, rushing to gather the last of the herbs from the garden. Thomas saw his chance. He waited for them to be completely distracted, and then he slipped away from his chore, his heart pounding in his chest. He made his way to the back of the house, where the heavy wooden door to the cellar was located. It was secured with a large, rusted padlock. He'd spent a few quiet moments with the lock a day earlier, observing its mechanism. He'd practiced with a bent piece of wire from the barn, a makeshift tool that felt too small and flimsy in his trembling hands. Now, with the threat of the storm and the sister's absence as his only cover, he went to work. The lock was old and the tumblers were loose. With a series of delicate, agonizingly slow twists and turns, he heard a soft click. He held his breath, fearing the sound would carry on the wind. But the storm was gathering its fury, and the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof. He gently lifted the padlock and opened the door. A rush of cold, damp air, thick with the smell of earth and decay, hit him in the face. He lit a match, and the small flame cast a flickering, dancing light into the darkness. He descended the rough-hewn wooden steps, each creak a loud, terrifying sound in the silence. The cellar was much larger than he had expected. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of preserved vegetables and sacks of potatoes, exactly as the sisters had said. But that wasn't all. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them. Tucked away in a shadowy corner, a small, chilling collection of personal belongings. There was a leather-bound wallet, its contents scattered, a tattered photo of a woman and child, a few coins. Next to it, a tarnished silver locket lay open, a portrait of a young woman inside. A small, intricately carved wooden pipe lay beside a pocket watch, its hands frozen at a specific time. Thomas recognized the watch. It had been Jedediah's. The sight of it made his blood run cold. There was no doubt now. These were the possessions of the disappeared. But there was more. The far end of the cellar held several large, empty barrels. The air around them smelled different, a metallic, almost coppery scent that made his stomach churn. The barrels themselves were stained with a dark, reddish-brown liquid. He cautiously approached them, his breath hitching in his throat. What was this? The liquid inside was thick and viscous. He touched his finger to a drop. It was sticky and smelled vaguely like the strange liquid he had seen in Beatrice's cauldron. But this was something else. This was blood. He felt the bile rise in his throat. A sudden rumble of thunder shook the house, and he heard the faint sound of footsteps above him. The sisters were coming back. Panic seized him. He had to get out. He couldn't risk being discovered. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind screaming. He quickly found the padlock, fumbled it back onto the door, and locked it. He scrambled up the stairs and back into the yard, just as the first torrents of rain began to fall. He ducked back to his woodpile, pretending to be working, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He had expected to find a body. He hadn't. But what he had found was infinitely more terrifying. The personal effects proved the disappearances were real. The empty barrels, the smell of blood, and the viscous, coppery liquid. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple murder. It suggested a process, a horrifying, methodical process. He looked at the farmhouse, now a dark, menacing shape against the grey sky, and he knew. The sisters weren't just killing people. They were using them. They were harvesting them. And his family was next. The chilling discoveries in the cellar had given Thomas a terrifying clarity. The whiskey his father drank, the disappearances, the strange concoctions, it was all connected, part of a horrific methodical process, but he needed to know the details. He needed to understand the why and the how. The answer, he believed, lay in the one place he had yet to fully explore. Beatrice's kitchen, the heart of their terrible work. He spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, his senses sharpened by fear. He was no longer a boy. He was a survivor, a silent observer in a house of predators. He watched Beatrice, her every movement, her rituals. He noticed she kept a small hinged cabinet above the stove, locked with a tiny key she wore on a chain around her neck. He assumed it held spices or herbs, but his gut told him it was something more. His opportunity came on a rare, cloudless day. Eleanor and Silas went to the far pasture to mend a stubborn section of fence, a chore that would take them most of the afternoon. Beatrice, as usual, was in the garden, meticulously tending to her herbs. Thomas, claiming he needed to find a specific tool, slipped into the house. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight in the air. He made his way to the kitchen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He examined the tiny lock on the cabinet. It was old and simple. He remembered seeing a small, sturdy hairpin on the floor of Henry's room the day before. He raced to get it, his hands shaking. He returned to the kitchen, and with a few delicate pokes and twists, he felt the lock click open. He held his breath and gently pulled the cabinet door open. Inside, it wasn't a spice rack. It was a single, large, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and cracked with age, and the paper inside was yellowed and brittle. Thomas took the book and moved to a small window, the light from outside illuminating the handwritten script. He opened it to the first page. The elegant handwriting, so at odds with the grotesque nature of its contents, titled the book, Recipes of the Widow Sisters. His stomach twisted as he began to read. It wasn't a cookbook. It was a detailed, meticulously kept journal of their crimes. The entries were dated, each one chronicling a new recipe. The first few pages described the art of luring lone travelers with kindness and hospitality. The next pages delved into the specifics of their ingredients. The journal explained how the human body, once tenderized and prepared, yielded a valuable essence. The text was written in a chillingly detached, almost scientific tone. Beatrice detailed the process of extracting and preserving certain fluids from their victims. She spoke of the moonshine Silas drank, explaining it was a concoction of various herbs and a small amount of a sedative, meant to render a person compliant and docile. The purpose of this was not just to make their victims easier to handle, but to make their essence purer and more potent. Thomas's eyes darted across the pages, his mind struggling to comprehend the full horror of what he was reading. He saw entries for a Jedediah the prospector and a Mr. O'Malley the trader. The details were horrifyingly specific, dates, times, and even notes on the quality of each victim. The book was a ledger of their malevolence. It explained the empty barrels in the cellar which were used to store their grotesque harvest. He turned a page, and a cold dread that surpassed anything he had ever known washed over him. He saw a new, recent entry. It was for his own family. The ink was fresh. Entry 1875, the Caldwell family. Silas, the father, a widower, grieving and weak, a perfect subject for the moonshine. He will be easy to manage. His essence, tainted by grief, will require more preparation. Thomas, the eldest son, observant, a problem, must be monitored closely. His mind is too sharp. We must break him first. Henry, the youngest, a simple, sweet child. He will serve as our final course, a pure essence. Thomas slammed the book shut, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold it. A sob caught in his throat. It wasn't just a threat. It was a plan, a detailed, terrifying plan. They weren't just a temporary haven, they were the final destination. The sisters were monsters, preying on the most vulnerable, and his family was their latest meal. He had to act, now. He quickly put the book back, his movements frantic and clumsy. He relocked the cabinet, but the tiny click was deafening in the silence of the room. He ran from the kitchen, the words from the journal branded into his mind. He had the answers he needed. Now he had to find a way to use them to convince his father of the truth before it was too late. He was a boy against two killers, and the clock was ticking. Armed with the horrifying truth from the recipe book, Thomas was consumed by a desperate urgency. The weight of his discovery was crushing, a heavy, cold stone lodged in his stomach that made it hard to eat, to sleep, to even breathe. He had to convince his father, the one person he was supposed to be able to trust, that their saviors were in fact their executioners. But how could he break through the fog of whiskey and grief that had so completely enveloped Silas? He was a boy with a truth too monstrous to be believed, facing a man who had chosen to be willfully blind. He waited for the first opportunity to speak to his father alone, but the sisters, as if sensing the shift in Thomas's demeanor, were more vigilant than ever. They were a constant, suffocating presence, their silent surveillance a cloak that hung heavy in the air. Eleanor, with her unnerving perceptiveness, was always by Silas's side, her hand often resting on his arm, engaging him in endless, placid conversation. She would talk about the weather, the livestock, or their shared grief, her voice a soft, hypnotic drone. Beatrice, a silent shadow, seemed to materialize whenever Thomas got too close. Her dark eyes, usually so placid, now held a sharp, watchful intelligence that followed his every move. He felt like a mouse in a cage, constantly being observed by two cats. Finally, a moment presented itself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Eleanor went to the chicken coop to gather eggs, her black dress a stark silhouette against the setting sun. Beatrice was in the garden, her back turned as she meticulously tended to her strange, medicinal herbs. Silas was resting on the porch, a half-empty glass of his special whiskey in his hand, a look of placid contentment on his face. Thomas seized the opportunity, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He sat down next to his father, the wooden porch swing groaning softly under their combined weight. He leaned in, his voice a low, urgent whisper, a sound that was swallowed by the vast, silent plains. "Pa," he began, "we have to go. We have to leave this place. Now." Silas stirred, his eyes, clouded and distant, blinked slowly. The potent liquid had dulled his senses, his reactions sluggish and slow. "Leave? Why, son? We're just settling in. This is a good life, a safe life." He gestured with the glass, the dark liquid sloshing gently inside. "No, Pa, listen to me," Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "They're not who you think they are. The sisters, they're killers. They lure people here and they kill them. They're poisoning you with that whiskey. It's what they do to their victims to make them easier to take." The last words were a choked whisper, a stark, terrifying admission he was unable to fully voice. Silas's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a placid, dismissive denial. He took another long sip from his glass, the liquid a familiar comfort on his tongue. "Thomas, stop this nonsense. You're being foolish. The sisters are saints. They took us in when no one else would. Look at what they've done for us. You're just a boy with an overactive imagination." The casual dismissal was a physical blow. "It's not imagination, Pa," Thomas insisted, his voice rising in frustration. "I found their cellar. It's full of things from the people who disappeared. Jedediah's watch, other people's wallets. I saw them, and I found their book. It's a journal, Pa. It explains everything. It says they're planning to use us, that you're a rich source of sadness, and that Henry is a pure essence." The last word was a whisper, a stark, terrifying admission. Silas shook his head, a sad, weary expression on his face that was filled with a pity that cut Thomas to the core. "You're talking crazy, son. I know what you've been through. It was hard on you, losing your mother. You've been alone, with too much time to think. But this is madness. You have to trust me. The sisters are good people. They've done nothing but help us." The psychological manipulation was complete. The constant dose of the whiskey had dulled his mind to the point where he was incapable of seeing the clear and present danger. His grief and desperation had made him a perfect, willing victim. He had put his trust in the sisters, And that trust was now an impenetrable shield against any truth, no matter how horrifying. He saw kindness where there was malevolence, sanctuary where there was a trap, and a home where there was a slaughterhouse. Just then, Eleanor returned, her footsteps silent on the porch. Her smile, which had seemed so comforting a few months ago, now looked like a predator's grimace, a mask of benevolence stretched taut over a face of pure malevolence. Her eyes, as they met Thomas's, held a chilling mix of pity and contempt. She had clearly heard his desperate pleas. She placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture of ownership that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Is everything all right, Silas?" she asked, her voice laced with a feigned concern that was colder than a winter wind. Thomas looks troubled. "He's just got a wild imagination, Eleanor," Silas said, his hand patting her own, a gesture of familiarity that twisted the knife in Thomas's heart. "He's a little high-strung. I'm sorry for the trouble he's caused you." The apology was like a physical blow to Thomas. His own father, dismissing his cries for help, apologizing to his tormentor for his very existence. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching despair. He had failed. He couldn't get through to him. He was completely alone. The sisters, sensing their psychological victory, became even more controlling. They limited Thomas's time alone with his father and brother, ensuring there was no opportunity for him to try and break through Silas's haze again. He was a threat, and they had him cornered. The sisters' true power was not in their physical strength, but in their ability to poison minds and break spirits. Thomas, now a prisoner in his own home, knew he had one last chance. He had to stop his father from drinking the whiskey. He had to act, and he had to do it alone. The failure of his direct confrontation with his father left Thomas with a single, horrifying certainty. He was on his own. His father was a lost cause for now, a captive of the sisters' psychological and physical poison. He couldn't afford to try and reason with him again. The risk was too great. His pleas had only served to alert the sisters to his true nature, making him a watched man. The only way forward was to sever the link between Silas and the whiskey. If he could get his father to stop drinking it, even for a day or two, perhaps his mind would clear enough to see the truth and the horrifying extent of the danger they were in. The task, however, was monumental. Eleanor was meticulously organized, and the whiskey decanter was a constant presence always within her sight, a golden-brown beacon of their doom. To simply pour it out would be an act of war, and Thomas knew he couldn't win that fight. He had to be subtle. He had to find a way to replace the deadly concoction with something harmless. Water. It was his only option. He began to devise a plan, his mind racing with possibilities. He had to create a distraction, a moment of chaos to draw the sisters away from the house. He needed an accomplice, someone they wouldn't suspect, someone who could be a part of the plan without knowing its terrible purpose. He thought of Henry, his sweet, innocent younger brother. Henry, with his trusting nature, could be his unwitting ally. That evening, as they were all sitting by the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Thomas pulled Henry aside. "Henry," he said in a low voice, his words carefully chosen, "I need your help with something. It's a secret mission, a game." Henry's eyes, wide and innocent, lit up with a spark of excitement. "A game? What kind of game?" "A very important one," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady and his fear from showing on his face. "You know how Pa gets tired after he drinks that special moonshine? He's not as strong as he used to be. I think the moonshine is making him sick. We have to help him feel better, but it has to be our secret." Henry's face grew serious with the weight of the mission. "Is Pa really sick?" "He will be if we don't do something," Thomas said, his mind a flurry of calculated lies. "The sisters, they don't know. I found a special way to help him, but I need you to create a diversion for me. When I give you the signal, I need you to go to the barn and make a very loud noise. As loud as you can. Can you do that for me? For Pa?" Henry nodded eagerly, his loyalty to his father and brother absolute. "Yes, Thomas, I can be really loud." Over the next few days they practiced. Thomas would find a moment when Eleanor and Beatrice were distracted and give Henry a subtle nod. Henry would then run to the barn and drop a bucket or slam a loose door. The sisters, always on alert, would immediately investigate. It was a perfect, if risky, diversion. The practice runs were a tense ballet of deception, each successful feint building Thomas's confidence and reinforcing the sisters' meticulous vigilance. The time for the real plan came. A sudden windstorm kicked up, rattling the windows and doors of the farmhouse, a perfect cover for their desperate act. Eleanor, always a perfectionist, became agitated by the noise. It was the perfect cover. "Silas, Thomas," she called out, her voice sharp with irritation, "come help me secure the shutters. And Beatrice, see to the horses. The wind is making them skittish." It was the moment Thomas had been waiting for. He looked at Henry, who was sitting on the floor with his toy soldiers, and gave him a short, sharp nod. Henry, understanding the signal, quietly slipped out of the room. As Eleanor directed Silas in the front of the house and Beatrice rushed to the barn, Thomas crept back inside. He raced to the kitchen, his hands trembling. The decanter of whiskey sat on the mantelpiece, its dark contents gleaming in the dim light. He quickly filled a small, empty bottle with water from the cistern. Just as he was about to pour the whiskey out, he heard a loud, satisfying crash from the barn. Henry had done his job. He worked quickly, his movements a blur of frantic energy. He poured the whiskey into the empty bottle, a dark, thick liquid with a cloying, almost sweet smell. He then filled the decanter with the fresh water, its clear, clean color, a stark contrast to the poison it had just held. He replaced the decanter on the mantelpiece, his heart hammering in his chest, his breathing ragged. He had done it. He heard the voices of Eleanor and Beatrice as they returned from the barn. They were complaining about the noise, about the loose doors and the spooked horses. He slipped back to his chore, a small, triumphant thrill running through him. He had taken the first step. He had replaced the poison. Now he just had to wait for it to take effect, for the fog to lift from his father's mind. He had to hope that his desperate gamble would pay off, and that he hadn't just sealed his own fate with this single, audacious act. The hours that followed the switch were a crucible of tension for Thomas. He watched his father, waiting for some sign, any sign, that the clear water was beginning to win the battle against the poison. Silas, however, was unchanged. He went about his chores with the same vacant placidity, and that evening he drank his nightly dose of what he believed to be the special moonshine. Thomas's stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. Was it not working? Had he made a mistake? Was it too late? The sisters, however, had noticed something. Eleanor, with her unnerving perceptiveness, had seen a flicker of something in Thomas's eyes that night. A hint of triumph. She didn't say anything, didn't confront him. But her gaze lingered on him, a cold and calculating stare. Beatrice, too, was more watchful, her movements around the house a little more deliberate, a little more predatory. The next morning, Thomas was mending a loose floorboard in the barn. He was alone, or so he thought. A sudden shadow fell over him and he looked up. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was a mask of cold fury, the kind smile she usually wore completely gone. Her eyes, usually a soft, warm brown, were now chips of hard, dark stone. "Thomas," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "I think we need to have a little talk." Thomas's heart leaped into his throat. He knew. She knew. There was no escape. He stood up, his hand unconsciously reaching for a nearby hammer. "You've been a troublesome boy, Thomas," she said, her voice growing colder with every word. "You've been snooping. You've been asking questions. We don't like questions here. And last night, you tampered with my moonshine." Thomas said nothing, his mind racing. He had to be careful. He had to feign ignorance. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am." Eleanor's lips curled into a cruel, mirthless smile. "Don't lie to me. I know what you did. I know you replaced Silas's drink with water. It was a foolish, childish thing to do. Did you really think you could deceive us? Did you really think you could ruin our carefully laid plans?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low hiss. "We have been watching you, Thomas, from the moment you arrived. You are just like the others. You are a means to an end. This farm, it's a living thing. It needs to be fed, and you, your father, and your little brother are all part of the recipe." The mask was completely off now. She was no longer the kind, generous widow. She was a monster, a predator, and her words were a sickening confirmation of his worst fears. "We don't just kill people, Thomas," she continued, her eyes gleaming with a manic fervor. "We use them. Their essence. It keeps us strong. It keeps us whole. It's what our husbands taught us, and your family is the most perfect ingredient we've found in years. Your father is a broken man, full of grief. He is a source of such rich sadness, it's a delicacy. And you are so full of life, so full of spirit. We will feast on it." Thomas felt a wave of nausea. He clutched the hammer, his knuckles white. "You're crazy," he spat out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Eleanor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Perhaps. But it doesn't change a thing, does it? The trap has been set. The door is locked. There is nowhere for you to run. We will finish what we started, and you will be the last to know the terror of it all." A sudden noise from the front of the house drew her attention. Beatrice was calling her name. Eleanor's face hardened. "Our business isn't over, Thomas, but it will be soon, very soon." She gave him a final menacing look and stalked away. Thomas was left alone, his body trembling, the hammer in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. The confrontation had been a disaster. He had been discovered. The sisters knew he was onto them, and their facade was gone. There was no more time for plans or subtle gestures. The game was over. He had to run. He had to save Henry, and somehow he had to get his father out of here. He was trapped, cornered, and the hunt had officially begun. Panic, cold and sharp, had a purpose. It drove Thomas out of the barn, his feet pounding against the hard-packed dirt, the sound swallowed by the howling wind that whipped across the plains. The air was thick with the scent of an approaching storm, a fitting backdrop for the maelstrom of terror that had just been unleashed. Eleanor's chilling words echoed in his mind, a constant, horrifying mantra of the fate that awaited them all. They knew. She had seen through his deception, and now there was no longer any pretense, no more veiled threats. It was raw, terrifying truth. His mind was a frantic jumble of adrenaline and desperation. He burst through the back door of the farmhouse, the slam of the wood against the frame a deafening report. His eyes darted across the room. He saw his father and Henry sitting by the fireplace, oblivious to the mortal danger they were in, their silhouettes a picture of domestic tranquility that was about to be shattered. The fire crackled, casting a warm, deceptive glow on their faces. Silas, still half asleep and half conscious from the effects of the whiskey, was slumped in his chair, his head lolling to one side. Henry was curled up in a blanket on the floor, his young face peaceful and innocent. "Henry, Pa," Thomas gasped, his voice ragged with fear and exertion. "We have to go. Now, get up. We have to run." Silas stirred, his eyes, clouded and groggy, blinked slowly as he tried to comprehend the urgency in his son's voice. "Thomas, what's wrong? What is all this commotion?" "There's no time, Pa. They know everything. They're going to kill us." Thomas's own hand trembled as he reached for Henry's, his fingers closing around his brother's small, warm palm. The contrast between the cold dread in his heart and the warmth of his brother's hand was a stark, painful reminder of what he was fighting for. "Get up, Henry. We have to leave." The sisters, alerted by the commotion, appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. Their faces were no longer masked by kindness. The benevolent facade had crumbled, revealing the predatory rage that lay beneath. Eleanor's lips were a thin, cruel line, her eyes filled with a terrifying, inhuman light. Beatrice stood behind her, a silent, menacing shadow, her gaze fixed on the rifle above the fireplace. "You're not going anywhere, Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice a low snarl that was devoid of any emotion. Thomas knew they were outmatched. He was a boy with a single-minded purpose against two cunning and ruthless killers. He looked around wildly, his mind racing. The front door was too far, and the sisters blocked the exit. His eyes landed on the old rifle above the fireplace. It was a relic, an antique, but he had seen Silas use it to hunt deer. It was their only chance. He let go of Henry's hand, shoved his brother behind him, and lunged for the rifle. He grabbed it, his hands clumsy with fear, the cold steel a shocking weight in his hands. He swung it around, pointing it at the sisters. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of terror and bravado. "I'll shoot. I swear I will." Eleanor and Beatrice hesitated for a moment, surprised by his audacity. Their expressions morphed from rage to a cold calculation. They knew a boy's bluster. They knew he had never fired a weapon at a human being. But the threat, however thin, was enough to give Thomas a critical moment. It was just enough time. Thomas grabbed his father by the arm, dragging him towards the front door. "Pa, run!" he pleaded, his voice a desperate whisper. Silas, confused and disoriented, stumbled after him, a dead weight in his grasp. The years of grief and the weeks of poison had left him with no will of his own. "Thomas, what are you doing?" "Saving you," Thomas roared, the words a primal scream of frustration and love. He pushed open the front door, and they all spilled out into the late afternoon light. The air was heavy and still, the sky bruised with coming rain. He didn't look back. He ran towards the small wooded grove that led to the hills, a place he knew from his chores, a place he had been forbidden to explore. Henry, his eyes wide with fear, ran beside him, clutching his brother's hand like a lifeline. Silas, with the fog of the whiskey finally beginning to lift, stumbled after them, the fear and confusion warring in his eyes, a dawning horror on his face. The sisters, enraged, were right behind them. They knew the land better than anyone. They were relentless. Thomas heard their shouts, their footsteps pounding in the dirt behind them, a sound like a drumbeat of death. He pushed himself to run faster, his lungs burning, his legs aching, the rifle a heavy burden in his arms. He had to get them out of sight. He saw a thicket of brush and a small, narrow ravine that they could climb down into. He shoved Henry and Silas into the brush, their bodies shaking with terror. "We have to keep going," Thomas whispered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They know these woods. We have to make it to the main trail." But the sisters were not far behind. They were silent now, their presence a chilling certainty. A stone flew past Thomas's head, followed by a low, furious shout from Eleanor. They were hunting them, and they were closing in. Thomas knew that their lives now depended on his ability to outwit and outrun them. He had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than he had ever been in his life. He was a boy, yes, but he was a boy fighting for his family, and he would not be their next victim. He was a boy who had looked into the face of evil and refused to surrender. He was their only hope. The chase had been a grueling, relentless test of endurance and wit. Days had passed since they had fled the farmhouse, each one a blur of fear and exhaustion. The Caldwell family, battered and bruised, was a shadow of its former self. They had survived on meager rations of berries and water from streams, their bodies aching with every step. Silas, with no more whiskey to cloud his mind, was slowly, painfully coming back to himself. The fog was lifting, revealing a horrifying reality he was unable to fully comprehend. The shame was a searing fire in his gut. Thomas, his hero and son, had been right all along. They were not guests. They were prey. They were cornered now, high in the desolate hills, the unforgiving landscape offering no further refuge. The cold wind howled, a mournful dirge for their inevitable fate. The sisters, like patient wolves, had tracked them. They appeared at the crest of the hill, their faces etched with a cold, triumphant malice. They were not tired. They were invigorated by the hunt, their black dresses a stark contrast to the pale, dusty earth. "There you are," Eleanor said, her voice a chilling whisper that carried on the wind. "The game is over, Thomas. Come on home." Silas, for the first time in weeks, was fully lucid. He looked at his son, at the raw terror in Henry's eyes, and at the two women who had nearly destroyed his family. The full, monstrous truth of their deception hit him like a physical blow. He had been so blind, so foolishly trusting. He had endangered his children, his one remaining family. He was a broken man, but his father's instinct, dulled for so long, flared to life with a primal, ferocious power. He looked at Thomas, at the strength in his son's eyes, and made a decision. "Go," he said, his voice a low, raspy command, but filled with an iron will. "Thomas, take your brother and go. I'll hold them off." Thomas, terrified, shook his head. "No, Pa, we're a family. We stay together." "I'm not a liability anymore, son," Silas said, a new, fierce determination in his eyes. "I'm a man, and I will not let them harm you. Not again. Now go. Run." Eleanor and Beatrice, sensing their victory, began to close in, their faces twisted into a grotesque parody of smiles. Silas, with a strength born of pure desperation, charged forward, a makeshift club in his hand. He was no match for them, but he was a diversion. He was their father, their protector, and he was giving them a fighting chance. Thomas, with a single, heart-wrenching glance at his father, took Henry's hand and ran. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, down the hills and towards the main trail. They were alone again, but this time they had a hope, a desperate, fragile hope. They ran for what felt like an eternity, and then a miracle. They saw a cloud of dust on the horizon, a wagon in the distance. They ran towards it, stumbling, falling, and getting up again. It was a trading family, a kind-faced couple with 2 children. They saw the terror in Thomas and Henry's eyes and took them in, without question. The woman gave them water and bread, her kind face a stark contrast to the monsters they had just escaped. Thomas, in a hoarse, broken voice, explained everything. The sisters, the farm, the disappearances, the cellar, the horrifying truth of their recipes. The trading family, horrified, took them to the nearest town, a small settlement of a few hundred people. Thomas told his story to the sheriff, his words a painful recount of the last few months. The townsfolk, listening with a mixture of skepticism and grim fascination, finally agreed to investigate. A posse of men led by the grizzled sheriff rode out to the Caldwell farm. Thomas and Henry waited, their hearts in their throats. The hours stretched into an agonizing eternity. Finally, the men returned. They brought with them the body of Silas Caldwell, found in a shallow grave in the woods, a look of grim determination still on his face. He had fought, and in the end, he had won. They had found the cellar, the empty barrels, the personal effects of the disappeared, and the sinister recipe book. They found Eleanor and Beatrice, captured and bound, their masks of humanity gone, replaced by a cold and inhuman rage. The sisters were led away in chains, their reign of terror at an end. The horror was over, but the scars remained. Thomas and Henry were now orphans, but they were not alone. They were survivors. They buried their father next to a small stream, a place that felt peaceful and far from the darkness. The townsfolk, moved by their courage, took them in, offering them a new life, a real chance. One day, months later, Thomas and Henry stood on a hill, looking at the horizon, at the endless stretch of land. It no longer looked like a desolate, empty place. It was a place of new beginnings, of hope. They had faced the deepest darkness and survived. They had lost their parents, their innocence, and their home, but they had found something else. They had found each other, a bond forged in fear and resilience. The road ahead would be long, but they would walk it together, carrying the memory of their father, a man who had finally seen the truth and had sacrificed himself to save them. The sinister widow sisters were gone, their twisted recipes a thing of the past, but the lesson, a dark and terrible reminder of the human capacity for evil, would live on, a whisper on the winds of the Wild West.